President Trump is representing our country. He's the right guy to do deals. He's a deal maker, and I think he'll come out of this summit with a lot of business opportunity.
He spent nearly 5 decades in public life, and yet almost no one could say who, if anyone, ever truly had his heart. That's the strange, quiet mystery that trailed Lindsey Graham from the moment he first won a South Carolina House seat in the early 1990s to the final days of a Senate career that ended not with retirement, but with sudden and shocking loss. On July 11, 2026, Graham died at 71 after what his office described as a brief and sudden illness, later confirmed by a preliminary medical examination to be an aortic dissection, a tear in the body's main artery. He had spoken with President Trump just hours earlier. He had returned days before from a trip to Ukraine, one of dozens of overseas missions that defined his final years in office. And he died, as he had lived for most of his adult life, without a spouse, without children, and without the kind of personal narrative that usually accompanies a politician of his stature. That absence, more than any policy fight, is what people are asking about now. To understand why, you have to go back to where Graham came from. He was born in 1955 in Seneca, South Carolina, a small town where his family ran a restaurant and pool hall attached to a liquor store. His childhood was marked by loss most people never fully recover from. His mother died when he was 21. His father died 13 months later. Graham, barely into adulthood, became the legal guardian of his younger sister, Darlene, who was still a teenager. He has spoken about those years publicly many times, describing how he had to grow up almost overnight, juggling law school with raising a sibling, learning to cook, do laundry, and manage a household budget while grieving both parents in rapid succession. Friends and biographers have pointed to that period as the root of something that shaped the rest of his life. An instinct to prioritize duty and family obligation over the kind of personal relationships that might have otherwise taken center stage. After finishing his law degree at the University of South Carolina, Graham served as a military lawyer in the U.S. Air Force, an experience that gave him both his nickname among colleagues as a defense attorney and the foundation of the hawkish, internationalist worldview that would define his Senate career. He stayed in the Air Force Reserves for decades, eventually retiring as a colonel in 2015. A fact he brought up often when arguing for American involvement abroad. It was this military identity, paired with his folksy South Carolina charm, that carried him into the state legislature, then the U.S. House in 1994, and finally the Senate in 2002, where he would serve for more than 2 decades. Throughout that entire span, Graham never married. In a political culture that often treats a spouse and family as both a talking point and a kind of public reassurance, his bachelor status made him an outlier, and it made him a target. Beginning in the 2000s and intensifying through the 2010s, rumors about his sexuality circulated persistently in tabloids, on social media, and among political opponents, some of whom used the speculation explicitly as a weapon during his re-election campaigns. Graham addressed it directly on multiple occasions, publicly and unambiguously denying the rumors and, at times, expressing frustration that his personal life had become fodder for attack ads and online mockery. No journalist, biographer, or documented source ever produced verified evidence of a secret relationship, and Graham himself never confirmed one. What existed instead, based on everything reported and observed by those who covered him closely, was a life built around friendship, mentorship, and political brotherhood rather than romance. The most significant relationship of Graham's adult life, by nearly every account from colleagues, journalists, and Graham himself, was not romantic at all. It was his friendship with Senator John McCain of Arizona. The two men were nearly inseparable for close to 2 decades, traveling together on congressional trips, appearing jointly at press conferences, and famously spending holidays as part of what McCain's family called their extended circle. Graham has said in interviews that he considered the McCain family his own, and after McCain's death from brain cancer in 2018, Graham spoke about the loss in deeply personal terms, describing a grief that mirrored losing a parent all over again. Some who covered Washington for decades have suggested that the emotional core of Graham's personal life, the thing that came closest to unconditional attachment, was this friendship rather than any romantic partnership. It was, by every observable measure, the deepest bond he maintained outside of blood family. That is not to say Graham lived without warmth or without people close to him. He remained close to his sister Darlene throughout his life, often crediting her for keeping him grounded. He was known among Senate staff and colleagues, even political rivals, as unusually accessible and quick to strike up genuine friendships across party lines, something increasingly rare in a polarized Congress. His bond with Senator Joe Biden, before Biden became president, was well documented, the two men serving together on the Judiciary Committee for years and maintaining a cordial relationship even as their politics diverged sharply. Graham's willingness to build relationships with people who disagreed with him politically was, in many ways, the closest thing to a defining personal trait beyond his hawkish foreign policy views. His political career was itself a study in transformation. Graham first rose to national attention as one of the House managers during President Clinton's impeachment trial in 1999, positioning himself early as a serious, process-oriented conservative voice. He later became one of the Senate's most vocal advocates for military intervention abroad, a stance he held with remarkable consistency through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and into the conflicts in Syria and Ukraine decades later. He ran for president in 2016, focusing almost entirely on national security, but withdrew from the race after failing to gain traction, later throwing his support behind other candidates before eventually aligning closely with Donald Trump, a relationship that itself surprised many observers given how sharply Graham had criticized Trump during the 2016 primary. That alliance became one of the defining and most scrutinized partnerships of Graham's later career, with critics accusing him of abandoning earlier principles and supporters praising him for pragmatic loyalty to a president who came to rely on him for foreign policy counsel. By the time of his death, Graham was in the middle of a campaign for a fifth Senate term, having just won his Republican primary in June 2026 with a commanding majority over his opponent. He was widely expected to win re-election in November. Tributes following his death came from across the political spectrum, from Trump, who described their relationship in deeply personal terms, to Senate colleagues on both sides of the aisle who spoke of a man who, whatever one thought of his politics, treated people with a rare degree of personal warmth. Governor Henry McMaster was left with the responsibility of appointing a temporary successor, while a new primary was scheduled to determine who would appear on the November ballot in Graham's place, a jarring and rapid political transition few had expected. What emerges from all of this, when you strip away the tabloid speculation and the unanswered questions about his private life, is the portrait of a man who built his identity almost entirely around public service, military duty, and personal loyalty to a small circle of people, rather than around romantic partnership. Whether that was a matter of personal choice, circumstance, or something he simply never discussed publicly is something no one outside his closest confidants can answer with certainty, and no credible source has definitively answered it either. What is certain is that Graham lived his adult life largely in the public eye, subjected to decades of speculation about the one part of himself he chose to keep private, and he died without ever needing to explain that choice to anyone. There is something worth sitting with in that. In an era when public figures are expected to package every part of themselves for consumption, Graham's insistence on privacy, even amid relentless speculation, stands out as almost old-fashioned. He gave the public his voice, his votes, his decades of floor speeches and overseas trips and television appearances, but he kept one door closed, and very few people, if any, were ever let inside. Perhaps that was simply who he was, a man shaped early by loss, who learned to direct his devotion toward duty, toward friendship, toward the people and causes he believed in, rather than toward the kind of romantic narrative the public so often demands. In the end, the questions about Lindsey Graham's private heart may never be fully answered, and perhaps that was always his intention. What remains, undeniably, is the record of a life spent almost entirely in service of something larger than himself, and that, more than any secret, may be the truest thing anyone can say about him.